Hey folks, Mythic Plus is finally releasing today, which means that many people are going to begin attempting Shadowlands dungeons at a much harder difficulty than before. While I'd imagine that most of you have seen the dungeons on Heroic or Mythic 0 at this point, Mythic Plus generally requires that you have a stronger understanding of the dungeon mechanics. Since I know not everybody has tons of time to watch detailed guides for every dungeon, I've created this video as a short summary of everything that you need to know in order to get through the dungeons without too much hassle. Without any further ado, let's get into the guide. To kick things off, I'm going to talk about Mists of Tirna Scithe, as many people seem to find this dungeon confusing. At the start of the dungeon, there's a root wall to the left that Night Fae players can clear, allowing you to skip the first 2 packs of trash. There's another wall like this just before the first boss, which leads you to a clearing with multiple different consumable mushrooms, and each gives you 10% primary stat, but it does not stack. The first boss, Ingram Malok, is really easy. Simply dodge the bewildering pollen casts and Tears the Forest bolts, and then DPS Droman Ulfurin until he reaches 20% health. At this point, he'll stun Ingram Malok, making him take increased damage, and you can lust to burn him down. After repeating this process a few times, the boss should be dead. Next comes the maze, and the trash within it is honestly pretty easy. The challenging part of the maze is the puzzle. While it is possible to brute force this, it's much easier once you understand how it works. Each sigil in the maze has 3 characteristics, and each of those has 2 possible options. They are as follows. The sigil will either be a flower or a leaf. The sigil will either have a purple border or be borderless. The sigil will either be hollow or full. Each maze room has 4 pedestals with sigils on them, which get revealed as you walk close to them. In order to find the correct path, you need to find the sigil that has at least one unique characteristic compared to the others. This might sound confusing, so let me break it down with a visual example. Upon walking into this room, I pass a pedestal which has a hollow leaf and a border. After clearing the trash, I check the other pedestals. They have a hollow leaf with no border, a full leaf with no border, a full flower with a border. The correct answer here is the final sigil, as it's the only one with a flower instead of a leaf. Mistcaller is the second boss, and she has a few relevant mechanics. Patty Cake is a spell which stuns the tank, so make sure to interrupt it. Freeze Tag spawns a Vulpin which chases a random party member, and the person being chased should simply run away until it despawns. Guessing Game makes Mistcaller immune to damage and summons 4 clones, each of which has a sigil identical to the ones in the maze. The method of solving this is the same as in the maze. Simply find the clone with a sigil that has a unique characteristic. After defeating Mistcaller, you'll have to make your way to Tredova. There's a decent amount of trash along the way, but it's pretty easy to handle. It's worth noting that some of the mechanics can knock you back a decent distance, so standing right next to the edge is generally a bad idea. Additionally, one of the mobs casts an AoE Absorb Shield, but this can be completely negated with the Blood Elf racial Arcane Torrent. The final boss is also relatively straightforward. Simply kill the parasites that attack your party members and break his shield in order to interrupt him when he starts eating the Wild Seed. Finally, if you get Mind Linked to another player, just run away from them in order to break it. Next, we'll talk about the other side, which is the other dungeon in Ardenweald. Upon entering, you can either go left and fight Dealer Zyexxa, or right and fight Hakar the Soulflayer. While I don't think the decision matters a ton, I personally opt to go right, as Hakar has less trash, meaning you can have the cooldown on Lust recharging sooner. There are some trash packs along the central ring, but their mechanics are relatively trivial and not really worth covering. The trash in Hakar's hallway is pretty weird though, as there are multiple Atalai priests which cast a spell that transforms them into Sons of Hakar. While you can't prevent them from casting it, stunning them will cause them to have to recast the ability, so if you chain stuns of the mobs, you can kill them before they transform. Some of the other trash in this will also cast healing abilities, so be sure to interrupt that. Hakar is going to be a bit tricky, especially as you get higher up in Mythic Plus levels, as he's a damage and healing check boss that also has a few notable mechanics. For starters, he summons Sons of Hakar mobs throughout the fight, and you'll have to kill them ASAP before they can do too much damage. That said, they also spawn a blood pool when they die, so it's important that you kite them to the corner or the side of the room and kill them there in order to maximize your space. Additionally, Hakar casts his classic Corrupted Blood ability, so make sure you move 7 yards away from other players or it'll spread to nearby people. Finally, Hakar casts Blood Barrier, which deals group-wide damage and shields him depending on how much damage he deals to you. While shielded, Hakar cannot be interrupted, and he will begin to cast Blood Barrage, so make sure to break his shield quickly in order to interrupt this cast. Next, you'll continue along the ring and fight the Mana Storms. Their trash can seem pretty complex, but in reality it's pretty simple to deal with. When the robots are about to self-destruct, simply CC them and run away in order to not die to their explosion. While there is a Frogger section here, it's worth noting that you can completely bypass this as either a Demon Hunter or through the use of Venthyr teleports and Warlock gateways. When actually fighting Millhouse Manastorm, make sure to stand in between him and his power crystals, as they grant you a damage buff and prevent him from receiving it instead. Additionally, when Millhouse casts Chilled Heart, make sure to interrupt his Frostbolt casts, as they're buffed by 450%. When fighting Maleficent, bombs will occasionally spawn that need to be defused before they blow up and deal massive group-wide damage. Lastly, both Millhouse and Maleficent have mechanics which can damage and stun each other if you drag them into it, but the hitboxes on these are generally extremely generous, so it's likely you'll accomplish this even if you don't try to do it intentionally. After defeating the Mana Storms, you'll continue onwards towards Dealer Zyx's room. Most of her trash is relatively straightforward, but there's one dragon which can be a bit tricky. When it casts Wailing Grief, move out of melee range or you'll be feared. This ability also pulls you closer to the target itself, so you'll have to start running early or pop a movement speed increase. Dealer Zyxa is relatively simple, and most of her mechanics revolve around interactions between her bombs and her portals. Her portals will send players up into the air, and she'll place a bomb on a random player. In order to handle this, just have the player with the bomb jump into a portal, which will blow it up above the group, preventing anybody else from taking damage. Also, when Dealer Zyxa starts casting Explosive Contrivance, every player will need to jump into a different portal in order to not suffer massive damage. Finally, you'll have to head back to the center ring to fight Muzala, and while he may seem pretty complicated, he's actually a very easy boss when you understand him. Muzala casts a bunch of different abilities during his platform phase, but all of them are extremely easy to notice and avoid, so they're just not worth covering in great detail. Muzala's primary mechanic, though, is Shadow Reality, which will instantly kill anybody nearby, but if you get 80 yards away, it won't do anything. The easiest way to achieve this is just by hopping into one of the portals spawned by Bwonsamdi, but it is worth noting that you can easily run down the nearby staircases to outrange Muzala that way. During this phase, all you have to do is kill Muzala's Shattered Visages and then interact with the nearby totem. This will cause Bwonsamdi to deal 20% of Muzala's health and damage at the start of the next phase, in addition to giving the entire party 30% haste per totem destroyed. While this is pretty much all you need to know in order to kill the boss, it is also worth noting that there's no limit to the amount of totems you can destroy in a single phase. If you split up your group between the staircases and the portals, it is actually pretty easy to kill all 4 totems in one phase, at least on lower difficulty levels, as you can see my group doing in this clip on Mythic 0. Next, we'll head over to Maldraxxus and talk about the Theater of Pain. You'll fight the first boss in a front of challengers almost immediately after entering the instance. This fight can be a bit tricky, as it has 3 enemies, each with its own set of abilities. I won't go into details on every single ability, but the general idea of the 3 bosses is this. Desia deals heavy tank damage and reduces healing taken, and when at low health, she gains an Absorb Shield and fixates random players. Paysaran does group-wide damage and shoots bolts at random players, along with spawning bad pools beneath their feet. Sathel casts bolts on random players too, but he will also heal the other bosses, though it is worth noting that this effect is dispellable. Additionally, when at low health, he will gain an Absorb Shield that makes him immune to interrupts. Finally, an enemy named Zira the Underhanded will periodically attack a random player, stunning them and dealing heavy damage until either 10 seconds have passed, or she has been damaged to a reasonable degree. Her attacks can quickly lock down and kill anybody, even a geared tank, so it's extremely important that you swap to her immediately. As for boss order, I would generally recommend killing either Paysaran or Sathel first, and then killing the other one of those second, as any good tank really shouldn't struggle to survive Desia's damage output. After killing this boss, you're able to fight your way to Gorechop, Zav the Unfallen, or Kultharok, and you can do them in any order that you choose. From what I can tell, there really isn't any time difference depending on what order you choose, so I'd simply pick the bosses based on which ones you want to use Bloodlust for. For starters, Gorechop is really straightforward, as he mostly does a lot of tank damage and drags in players for a nearby AoE. He also summons adds, but they don't really do a lot and just passively lose their health over time, so it's generally just better to ignore them until they die. Gorechop's only real mechanic is the wall of meat hooks that he summons, but as long as you dodge that and DPS him down, he should be pretty easy. Next, I usually go to Kultharok, and while the path leading up to her has some interesting portal hopping mechanics, the mobs there are all relatively easy and just not worth discussing in great detail. Just be careful not to get hit by the wind mechanics on the final and potentially second to last platform depending on what you choose, and then you shouldn't have too much trouble. Kultharok herself is also pretty simple, as most of her mechanics just serve to put more strain on your healer. But at certain points she will remove the souls of random party members, which cause them to take damage and be silenced until they run on top of their souls in order to reclaim it. It's also worth noting that reclaiming your soul will give you a 30% damage buff for 30 seconds, so this is a really good time to save your cooldowns for. After Kultharok, I generally fight Zav the Unfallen, which is a cool but relatively easy boss. Most of his mechanics just aren't very hard to avoid, provided you kill his oppressive banner, which stacks a movement slowing debuff on people. Periodically, Zav will also throw 2 group members into the nearby arena, and one of them will have to defeat the other in order to get a damage buff. Winning the duel will give you a 10% damage buff, as mentioned, but losing it will give you a minus 10% damage debuff. Finally, you'll head back to the start of the instance in order to face off against Mordretha the Endless Empress. Throughout the fight, Mordretha will place Manifest Dread circles around each party member, which explode upon expiration, so you'll need to keep a loose spread. When they eventually expire, they'll also summon adds called Deathwalkers, which you'll want to swap to and AoE down immediately. At the same time, she'll summon a portal which drags all players towards it and deals damage when you're within its circle, so you'll need to make sure that you run against the pull without clipping into other group members' circles. Mordretha will also summon spirits at 50% health, which cast some pretty nasty AoEs, and ghost rams which charge across the room, one-shotting anybody that they come into contact with. While these mechanics do hit hard, they're also entirely avoidable, so once you're comfortable dodging it, the fight should be pretty easy. Now that we've discussed Theater of Pain, it's time to dive into the objectively worst dungeon in the expansion, Plaguefall. Before the first boss, there's a ton of trash to fight in this dungeon, which is going to be a recurring theme here. While it is possible to skip a large portion of this and later trash, you're still going to need to get kill count to complete Mythic Plus dungeons, so you'll have to figure out where you personally feel is the most optimal way to get your kill count in this dungeon. The first boss, Globgrog, or known as Big Slime Dude, has an unavoidable AoE, Plague Stomp, and a frontal cone attack, Slime Wave. The range in his cone attack is massive, so I'd recommend staying close to the boss in order to easily dodge out of its way. The main mechanic that Slime Dude has is the ooze adds which he summons from the pools at the edge of the room, as they'll slowly move towards him and heal him if they get into melee range. This is obviously very bad, but luckily the oozes can be killed and CC'd, so DPS will want to hard swap to them as soon as they spawn. I recommend trapping or slowing some, and then having everybody focus the others down one at a time, as it gives the tank a bit more wiggle room to kite the boss. Once again, most of the trash after Globgrob can be skipped, but you'll likely want to fight a good amount of it, as you can use the plague barrels nearby to quickly nuke large groups of enemies. When you reach Dr. Ickis, it's important that you clear out all 3 platforms before engaging him, as you'll hop around to each of them during the fight. Dr. Ickis' fight is extremely annoying, as he deals heavy ticking damage to the group and constantly leaps away, forcing DPS to have significant downtime. That said, the only truly dangerous mechanic is his Plague Bomb, which explodes for lethal damage on the entire group if you don't kill it in time. Generally speaking, this isn't too hard to kill, but it's important that you drag the purple congealed slime adds away from the bomb, as purple slimes cause nearby allies to take 75% reduced damage. Domina Fellblade is next up, and while her fight seems really confusing, there's a pretty simple way to handle all of her mechanics. Her primary mechanic is Solitary Prey, which causes her to web wrap anybody who's stood away from other players for more than 8 seconds. Dealing with this is pretty simple, just make sure your entire group stacks up. However, she'll also cast Shadow Ambush on a random player periodically, forcing them to briefly run out of the group. This might seem scary, but you have more than enough time to take this mechanic out and then make it back to your group before you get stunned. Domina's most problematic mechanic is Brood Assassins, which summons multiple stealth adds that spam a dagger throw at random targets. In order to reveal these fighters, you need to either run on top of their webs or cast something like Flare, but this means that everybody needs to follow the tank pretty closely so nobody gets caught up in a web wrap. As long as you manage to do this, you can kill off the spider assassins 1 by 1 or 2 by 2 pretty easily, and the boss should be pretty straightforward from there on. Lastly, you have to fight Margrave Stradama, who seems like she'll be a bit of a damage and healing check as people begin to get into higher keystone levels. She places a pretty nasty dot in the group for healers to deal with, and the adds she summoned need to be killed ASAP, as they do quite a lot of damage to the tank. At 66 and 33% health, Stradama will submerge into the slime and begin a tentacle slap intermission. All of the damage here is avoidable, so just make sure you learn the patterns and you really shouldn't struggle with it. The only important thing to take note of is that the Malignant Spawn ad will cast an ability called Touch of Slime, which spawns a little circle that tanks need to soak. Now, we might have finished talking about Maldraxxus dungeons, but it's time to talk about the Curian dungeons, starting with Necrotic Wake, which is basically just another Maldraxxus dungeon in disguise. So the trash leading up to the first boss can be pretty nasty, especially for tanks. I'd recommend focusing the Necromancers down and interrupting the Meat Shield cast in the Abominations, as it gives them a pretty large absorb shield. The first boss, Blightbone, is the closest thing to a Patchwork boss that you'll find in this expansion. The only notable mechanic he has is the worms that he summons, which you'll need to swap to immediately as they explode for lethal group-wide damage if left alive for too long. One of the next trash packs you'll have to fight has 5 caster mobs, and this can be really problematic to deal with, as they spam cast Necrotic Bolt, which deals heavy magic damage to the tank on top of applying a healing absorb. However, there's an interactable object nearby called Discharged Anima that you can pick up, and it deals massive damage upon activation for 8 seconds, along with constantly silencing enemies for its entire duration. This is a really easy way to deal with this particular trash pack, because it constantly interrupts their Necrotic Bolt casts and cleaves them down really efficiently. There's also a few other interactable items that you can use to deal damage, such as hammers and javelins, but they're not nearly as powerful as the Anima. Amarth the Harvester is the next boss, but he's honestly so easy it's just not worth discussing him. As long as you dodge his clearly telegraphed attacks, like his frontal breath, and kill the skeleton ads he summons as soon as possible, he should fall over without much hassle. When fighting the next room of trash within the Necropolis, it can be pretty tempting to pull together multiple packs. That said, I would highly recommend only pulling one group at a time, as each has really nasty casts or debuffs, so even pulling 2 packs at once can spiral out of control on higher keystone levels. Surgeon Stitchflesh is the next boss, and he's also super trivial once you understand how he works. Simply aim the Abomination's meat hook at the boss's platform in order to grip Stitchflesh down, and then pop Lust and all of your cooldowns to burn him before he jumps back up. At various points while on the ground, Stitchflesh will also fixate random players, but he moves 60% slower, so it's extremely easy to kite him. This process will just repeat over and over until Stitchflesh dies. Nalthor the Rhymebinder is a bit more complex, as he has multiple mechanics which can easily wipe you if you're not careful. Frozen Binds places a debuff on a random party member, and when it explodes, it'll root anybody caught within the targeting circle. The debuff itself, or the subsequent root effect, needs to be immediately dispelled, as Nalthor also frequently casts Comet Storm, which causes comets to crash down at your location after a few seconds. These will kill even geared tanks extremely quickly, so it's really important that you move away from them. Nalthor's final noteworthy mechanic is Dark Exile, which sends a random DPS player away to complete an obstacle course and kill a mob. Once they accomplish this, they can talk to a Kyrian NPC to get flown back to Nalthor's platform, and this NPC also gives the DPS player a 100% crit chance buff, making this a good opportunity to pop your cooldowns. Spires of Ascension is the other Kyrian dungeon, and while it has a lot of bland and repetitive trash, the boss fights are quite interesting. That said, there is one notable trash mob which reappears throughout the instance, which is a fat Forsworn robot that spam casts Rebellious Fist. This ability really hurts, so make sure you interrupt it as much as possible, and if the robot's standing in a black puddle, you'll need to drag it out or it'll be immune to interrupts. After a few packs of forgettable Forsworn enemies, you'll fight the first boss, Kintara. She's linked to her pet, causing anybody to stand in between them to take heavy ticking damage. Additionally, the 2 NPCs will share health pools, so any classes that can benefit from 2-target cleave will love this fight. During Phase 1, Kintara will follow the tank around and cast Overhead Slash, which hits all players standing in front of her, while her pet runs to random locations and casts nasty black projectiles which must be dodged. After a little while, she'll take to the skies and begin to throw javelins at random party members, which you just need to run out of the group. The trash between the first and second boss is also extremely forgettable, but it's worth noting that there's a spear you can pick up as a Kyrian player, which allows you to stun a group of mobs for about 10 seconds, as well as making them take increased damage. This isn't incredibly important, but it's a nice thing to have for some of the more challenging pulls if you happen to have a Kyrian in the group. The second boss, Ventanax, is more annoying than he is difficult, as he uses blink attacks against random players and summons projectiles which knock you up into the air. That said, if you dodge his projectiles, he really shouldn't be much of a threat. After some long RP flights and boring trash packs, you'll fight Orifrion, whose fight primarily revolves around his energy bar. He'll cast Imperial Ordnance, which shoots projectiles at players, and summons large pools of anima whenever they detonate. While he's within these pools, the boss won't lose any energy from casting his spells, and it will deal 20% increased damage, so it's important that your tank drags him out of it ASAP. Upon running out of energy, the boss will stop to recharge, taking 100% increased damage as his bar fills up. This is an ideal spot to lust and use all of your cooldowns. Additionally, while recharging, any anima pools will turn into coalesced anima balls that move towards Orifrion, and it's important that players will soak these, or they'll give him extra anima. After his energy recharges, the fight repeats until he dies. After one final long RP flight, you'll have to face 3 elite mobs before fighting Devos, the last boss. The elite mobs don't really have any notable abilities, but it is important that you only pull one at a time, as they buff each other if you pull multiple, making it a very easy way to wipe your group. The fight with Devos begins on the ground, where she has 3 important mechanics to discuss. Run Through will target a random player and cause Devos to charge to them, dealing damage to anybody in her path. Abyssal Detonation deals lethal damage to all players, so you need to stand in the safe zone summoned by Carestia the Firstborn in order to survive it. Lost Confidence is a debuff that deals damage to players and can be dispelled by a healer, but it summons a pool of goo on the ground, so affected players should run to the edges of the room before calling for a dispel. At various points in the fight, Devos will activate an anima conduit and fly up into the air, making her impossible to attack. In order to get her back onto the ground, you'll need to gather the anima orbs around the room and bring them to the conduit, while dodging the harmful wind abilities. Once you've empowered the conduit, a player can grab the Archon Spear and throw it at Devos, which causes the fight to return to Phase 1. This process will just repeat until Devos dies. Moving on to the final zone, it's time to talk about the Halls of Atonement in Revendreth. In order to be able to attack the first boss, Halkias, you need to destroy the 3 mini versions of him scattered across the first room. The first 2 are located to the left of the entrance, whereas the final one is located far to the right. While the rest of the trash in this room is pretty simple and not worth covering in detail, this also means that it's a great place to farm kill percentage in Mythic Plus, which enables you to skip some of the problematic trash later on. After all 3 avatars of Halkias are dead, he'll begin to power up, and after a short period of time, you'll be able to engage him. While Halkias isn't necessarily hard, it is crucial that you understand how his fight works, or otherwise you'll be killed pretty much instantly. At the start of the fight, Halkias will cast Sinlight Visions, which forces you to stand within the circle around him, or you'll be permanently feared until you die. As long as you do this, the fight is just a matter of moving out of the patches on the ground and dodging the refracting Sinlight laser beams summoned by Halkias. If you do this and burn him down, the fight is a joke. After defeating Halkias, you'll have to fight your way through a lot of annoying trash that will constantly stun you and knock you around. As mentioned earlier, I highly recommend clearing extra trash in the first room because it's pretty easy, and then using invisibility effects such as Potions, Engineering Belt, or Rogue Shroud to run straight to Echelon, the second boss in the instance. Echelon is super easy, but you need to understand how Stone Shattering Leap works. Echelon summons Undying Stone Fiends throughout the fight, which will transform them into stone form, making them unattackable and healing them up over time. That said, if a player targeted by Stone Shattering Leap drags it on top of the Stone Fiends, it'll one-shot them, meaning they won't be able to fully heal up in return. As long as you're able to stack and burn the Stone Fiends and then follow it up with a well-placed Stone Shattering Leap, you'll really not have any problems with Echelon. The trash leading up to the third boss is unskippable, but it's also not very challenging, provided you move out of the clearly telegraphed AoE circles. The third boss, High Adjudicator Elise, is a mostly healing check boss, but she does have one mechanic, Spectral Procession, which is kind of important to understand. This summons a ghastly parishioner, which fixates random players, and it's unkillable by conventional means. However, if you kite the parishioner into one of the nearby Vessels of Atonement, it'll instantly kill them. Other than this, just interrupt High Adjudicator Elise's casts, and she should die pretty simply. After defeating Elise, you'll only have one elite left to fight before the final boss. I'd highly recommend interrupting the enemy ASAP and dragging him behind a nearby wall, as he summons adds which have a tendency to free cast out in the distance. By dragging him behind the wall and standing there, all of the adds will be line of sighted, making it really easy to kill them all in a stack. Finally, you'll get to fight Lord Chamberlain, who has a few important mechanics that you should understand. For starters, he'll periodically cast a Frontal Cone AoE, so it's important that nobody stands near the tank. Lord Chamberlain's main mechanic, however, involves his Sinstone statues, which he'll throw at players with Telekinetic Toss and Telekinetic Onslaught. The latter ability will drag all 4 statues towards him, and he'll follow it up with a Telekinetic Repulsion cast, so it's important that you watch for the positioning of the statues in order to not get hit. Lastly, Lord Chamberlain will channel a beam of anima towards each statue, and you need to soak it or it'll pulse damage onto the entire group. The final dungeon we have to talk about is Sanguine Depths, and it's one of my personal favorites. While none of the trash have extremely complicated mechanics, there's a few cone and beam mechanics that they cast, which is just enough to keep you on your toes. Additionally, there are anima containers around the dungeon that Venthyr players can activate, and if you kill an enemy near them, you get a damage buff. This incentivizes you to do big pulls around these containers, which I would recommend as long as your group is prepared for them. The first boss, Cryx the Voracious, is mostly a damage and healing check boss, but he does have a few important mechanics. For starters, he has an interruptible cast, Hungering Drain, which you should use a kick for immediately. Additionally, he has 3 knockback-related abilities, 2 of which target the entire group, and 1 of which specifically targets the tank. Vicious Headbutt deals damage to the tank and knocks them back, so unless you're able to leap or glide back onto the platform, you'll have to tank him against the wall. Juggernaut Rush is cast on a random player in the group, and everybody needs to stand between the boss and the player in order to split the charge damage. Finally, when Cryx reaches 100 energy, he'll cast Severing Smash, knocking all players back and spawning an orb. If he collides with one of these orbs, it'll heal him for 12% of his maximum health, so it's important that you run on top of the orbs to soak them before this happens. After fighting Cryx, you'll face a few hallways of trash that are mostly the same as the ones you fought in the first hallway. Before long, you'll reach the second boss, Executor Tarvald, who spawns 2 Sin-touched anima orbs on pull which move in opposite directions around the circular boss room. I'd recommend dragging the boss a short distance down the hallway, as it makes it much easier to dodge each of the anima orbs as they wrap back around the room. Other than this, the boss is really easy, so just swap to the ads and avoid the puddles, and he should die pretty quickly. Immediately after defeating Tarvald, you'll be able to jump down and fight Grand Proctor Barilia. And while there is some trash within a room, it's entirely possible to defeat her without having to fight any of it. Most of Grand Proctor Barilia's damage is either unavoidable pulsing AoE or easy to avoid AoE circles, but Rite of Supremacy is one exception to this. This ability will normally one-shot players, but before it's cast, many small shards of light will appear throughout the room. Each shard you pick up reduces your damage taken by 20%, and it stacks up to 5 times. That said, unless you're pushing really high keys, I would say that most players would only need about 2 to 3 stacks, and a good tank should only require 1, if that. After defeating Barilia, one member of your group will need to pick up Zerali, which will grant you an extra action button that shields nearby allies for 65% reduced damage, removes all bleeds, and makes them immune to knockback effects. While anybody can use this, I generally like to pick it up and handle it as the main tank. Once you have Zerali, you'll need to fight your way through a long trash gauntlet, and while the mobs in the gauntlet aren't very interesting themselves, you'll also be fighting General Call, the last boss, at the same time. During the trash gauntlet, Call doesn't really have access to all of her abilities from her actual boss fight, but she will cast Gloom Squall, which deals heavy AoE damage and knocks players back, so everybody needs to stack under Zerali's shield in order to survive this cast. Every time Call loses 10% of her health, she'll become unattackable and retreat further down the hallway, up until the point where she reaches 70% HP. At this stage, Call will run all the way to her boss room, and you'll have to clear out a few final packs of trash before you can fight her. Call's actual boss fight also has Gloom Squall, so you should handle this the same way you did during the Trash Gauntlet. Other than that, Call only has 2 mechanics, Wicked Rush, which you should spread out for in order to avoid cleaving other players, and Piercing Blur, which just shoots avoidable beams across the platform. As long as you can dodge these mechanics and stack in Zerali's shield during Gloom Squall, Call shouldn't be too difficult. And with that, we've covered every Shadowlands Mythic Plus dungeon. While I may have not gone into immense detail on every mechanic, I do feel that all of the information presented here is the bare minimum that you'll need to know in order to have an easy time in Mythic Plus this week. Before I end this video, I want to quickly announce that I'll be streaming on my YouTube channel whenever the servers go up today, and I'll be spamming Mythic Plus dungeons pretty much up until my guild's scheduled raid time, which I will also be streaming. If you have any further questions about the dungeons, Castle Nathria, or just want to see strategies in action, it would be great to have you stop by. Anyways, I hope you all found this video helpful, and I wish you the best of luck in your Mythic Plus dungeons and Castle Nathria progression. See ya!